Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
This dossier examines a question that once lived on the edge of plausibility, but no longer can. The issue is not simply whether advanced electromagnetic and neurotechnologies exist. The public record already tells us they do. The real question is who is deploying them, against whom, and why our legal and medical systems remain structurally incapable of protecting ordinary civilians. This presentation connects three domains that are too often discussed in isolation: anomalous health incidents, surveillance capitalism, and human rights. Once those three domains are placed on the same table, the picture changes. What looked like scattered reports begins to resemble a coherent pattern. We begin with precedent, because precedent changes what can be honestly denied. First, the Moscow signal, a long-running microwave exposure incident involving the U.S. Embassy in the Soviet Union. Then, in Havana, in 2016, diplomats reported piercing noise, vertigo, pressure, and cognitive disruption. Then, the 2020 National Academies Review, which concluded that many distinctive acute symptoms were consistent with the effects of directed, pulsed radiofrequency energy. This is the Overton window shift. Once the U.S. government acknowledges that directed energy may injure personnel in official settings, the debate changes. The technology is no longer science fiction. It is an operational reality. And if hardware can target embassies, the next question is obvious: where else is it being used? This slide centers on the microwave auditory effect, the Frey effect, as a documented pathway for internal sound perception. Pulsed radiofrequency energy interacts with tissue, produces thermal expansion, creates an internal pressure wave, and the brain interprets that wave as sound, buzzing, clicking, even voice-like perception. The slide supports this with three layers: Frey's original work, later patent literature describing microwave-induced hearing, and attempts to weaponize the effect through military-adjacent programs such as Medusa. The point here is not that every sensational claim is proven. The point is narrower and more dangerous. Internal sound can be generated without ordinary external acoustics. Once that is understood, hearing something no one else hears stops being a sufficient basis for instant dismissal. The battlefield, according to the slide, has shifted from physical terrain to the human brain. NATO's own language on cognitive warfare is invoked here. Attempts to alter, shape, disrupt, undermine, and modify human thinking and decision-making. That matters because it moves the discussion from fringe suspicion to formal doctrine. The objective described is not simply to destroy a person physically, but to collapse them internally, to fracture their sense of reality, autonomy, and trust. In other words, the strategic target is not just the body, it is the coherence of the self. This is one of the sharpest slides in the deck. A diplomat reports Havana syndrome symptoms and is treated as a national security case. A civilian reports nearly identical symptoms and is labeled mentally ill, dismissed, or tagged as a targeted individual. One receives investigation, classification, and sometimes compensation. The other receives disbelief. The reality line on this slide is brutal. The hardware does not check for a diplomatic passport before causing harm. If the symptoms are technically possible in one class of person, they cannot be declared impossible in another, simply because the second person lacks institutional status. This slide pushes back on the stereotype. The target profile presented here is not chaos, dysfunction, or classic late adolescent psychiatric decompensation. Instead, the deck points to high-functioning professionals, journalists, veterans, activists, lawyers, doctors, and whistleblowers. The citation to Niels Melzer's cybertorture framework adds another layer. Severe suffering can be inflicted without visible physical marks, through intimidation, sleep deprivation, sensory assault, and manipulation of function. The implication is that the modern victim may not fit the story that institutions are comfortable telling. And because they do not fit it, they are often ignored. Here, the deck frames harassment as a system rather than a collection of random events. First comes surveillance, data collection, device compromise, behavioral patterning. then isolation, slander, character damage, and severing of support networks. Then sensitization, gaslighting, overt surveillance cues, and street theater used to induce paranoia and plausible deniability. Finally, assault, directed energy, sleep deprivation, pain, and auditory harassment. The center stamp on this slide says it plainly: systemic neutralization. The goal is not necessarily immediate destruction. It is a breakdown, a gradual reduction of the person's credibility, resilience, and social footing. This slide shifts from social mechanics to physical pathways. The body is framed as a conductive medium, and buildings themselves as possible re-radiating structures. Wiring, structural metal, resonant cavities, low-frequency magnetic fields, and certain microwave bands are presented as ways to introduce energy into a room and couple it into a target without direct line of sight. Whether one accepts every detail or not, the forensic significance is this: environments may matter. The room is not neutral. The wall is not always a barrier. The architecture itself may participate in the attack surface. Now the deck zooms out. Satellites, phased arrays, beamforming, and passive sensing are introduced. The argument is that modern communications infrastructure is inherently dual use. Beam steering is already real. Passive radar using Wi-Fi or cellular reflections already exists. Unsecured or poorly secured links create opportunities for hijacking or misuse. The presentation is not claiming that every network is weaponized. It argues that the technical ingredients for persistent remote location, tracking, and directed focus are already present in ordinary infrastructure. The sky, in other words, is no longer empty. It is dense with systems that can see, steer, and follow. This slide ties the technical question to the commercial one. User app data becomes brokered data. Brokered data becomes live location data. Live location data becomes targeting intelligence for a rogue actor. The core insight here is chilling because it is mundane. No cloak and dagger tale is needed. A stalker, contractor, or bad actor can buy location access and subscribe to a person's movement through the same commercial pipelines that power ad tech. This is warrant-proof surveillance by market design. The state no longer needs to do all the watching. The market built the engine already. This is the perfect cover described by the deck. Overlap the symptoms of microwave harassment with the symptom language of schizophrenia. Auditory hallucinations, paranoia, withdrawal, isolation. Once the victim uses certain words, voices, rays, invisible attack, the institutional reflex is triggered. A psychiatric label does two jobs at once. It discredits the witness and protects the attacker. The slide is explicit that the strategic aim is provocation. Induce enough destabilization that the target appears unstable. Then let the system finish the job. This slide argues that the present regulatory landscape is a black hole. The FCC regulates interference, not biological assault. Police are trained to look for bullets, bruises, and blunt force, not RF spectra. Federal courts are often blocked by secrecy doctrines and state secrets privilege. The result is a jurisdictional no man's land, where no agency is clearly responsible, no investigative pathway is well built, and no victim can easily find a door that stays open. The law, in this telling, lags far behind the hardware. The dossier then pivots toward evidence. Continuous RF spectrum logging. Correlation of timed signal spikes with symptoms. Medical biomarker review, especially where Havana-type patterns may overlap. Infrastructure audits to identify rogue cell simulators, suspicious antennas, or environmental couplers. This is one of the most important moves in the entire deck because it drags the issue out of pure narrative and into a forensic method. Stories matter. But patterns, timestamps, and instrument logs matter more when institutions are hostile or skeptical. Evidence is how fog gets cut. This slide is pure strategy. Frame it as a human rights issue, citing cyber torture and bodily violation. Frame it as a privacy issue, focusing on data brokers, neural privacy, and regulatory delay. Frame it as a national security issue, arguing that civilians may be the canaries in the coal mine for domestic cognitive warfare. And then comes the golden rule: build a boringly concrete story. Focus on who, when, where, and the lack of oversight. Strip away the language most likely to trigger ridicule. Build the case brick by brick until even a hostile audience is forced to deal with the structure. The conclusion is uncompromising. We need more than piecemeal reform. We need a framework as serious as the threat. What this slide calls a Geneva Convention for the Mind. Investigations cannot disappear behind state secrets. The human mind cannot remain the last ungoverned battlefield. And the closing line drives the point home. The question is no longer whether these technologies exist. Patents exist, precedents exist, victims exist. The real question is whether society will allow the interior life of the human being to become just another domain of unaccountable force. For evidence, the strongest discipline is simple and ruthless. Keep a dated incident log. Preserve device anomalies. Log time and location patterns. Save screenshots in multiple places. And connect symptoms to measurable events whenever possible. In a case like this, the difference between story and record is everything.